Hi, Nat Doig here. Today's episode tells the story of how I eventually discovered the truth behind the legends of Biggleswade's Murder Bridge. It does include tragic deaths and murders from the 19th century, as well as ghost stories and a seance. Also, just to give you a heads up that if you stick around until the very end of the show, there is a trailer for a new horror podcast, The Rue Papers. It's by Emma Butler. You may recognise one of the voices that appear in later episodes of The Rue Papers, as I'm thrilled to say I play the part of Rose in the drama. More on that later. Hello and welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful and a little off kilter in the town of Biggleswade in Bedfordshire. Each episode, I'll tell you a tale of something strange and unique that has happened in this most English of market towns or its surrounding area. There's an older meaning to the word weird, which means to twist and turn. In Norse myth and in Anglo-Saxon times, this came to mean fate or destiny, all that was and is, and all that is yet to be. Whether it's tales of ghosts or flying saucer hoaxes, the big cat of Biggleswade, or the pot and poisoner, curious social history, or the Great Swan Mystery of 1935, we'll follow all the twists and turns and uncover fascinating stories that will speak to you today, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Weird in the Wade.
Help her.
Autumn, 1876. Biggleswade, a candlelit parlour. Winifred had never been afraid at one of John's spirit circles before. Her brother wasn't one for theatrics and thrills. His spirit circles were sedate, sometimes sombre affairs. His patrons were educated customers of his bookshop, respectable, true believers, not thrill seekers. But Winifred was not the only one to be afraid that night. As she glanced around the circle of guests, jagged shards of candlelight flickered across their faces, familiar faces transformed, twisted or petrified in fear. Mr. Kite's plump face was unusually pale. His eyes darted away from Winifred's as he shifted in his seat. Mr. and Mrs. Dell's were unusually inanimate. They were stiff, their faces mask-like. Elderly Jane Clark was biting on her paper-thin lower lip. A single drop of blood shone in a flurry of light as a draught disturbed the candle flames. John himself was trembling, his head cast down in a manner completely out of character for him, and the thing that had just frightened them all suddenly returned. The voices.
Help us. Help her. Help her. Help her. Help her. Help her. Help her. Please hear us. Listen. Please hear us. Please listen. Please listen. She needs justice. She cannot rest. We implore you. We implore you. I implore you. She's in the water. She's in the water. She's in the water. The water. She's cold. So cold. She's cold. She's cold. Sorry. Murder. Murder. She's cold. Murder. Murder.
John's head snapped back up.
Don't break the circle,
he commanded. Winifred felt Mr. Kite's grip on her hand tighten.
Listen,
John instructed.
We are blessed tonight. Robin Ashpole has brought us a gift that you can all experience, not just the sensitive. Listen, friends.
Winifred had never heard anything like it. Not even when she'd visited a charlatan theatrical séance in Cambridge. This was real. They were hearing the voices of the dead, of the dearly departed, and they had a message for them all. Winifred's fear was slowly scrubbed away by the waves of sound from the voices, the urgency in some, the matter-of-factness of others. They demanded to be heard. But what did it all mean? As the voices subsided, John began to speak again, but in his trance voice, gruffer than his waking voice. This was the voice of Robin Ashpole, his spirit guide.
I could not stop these voices being heard. I do not want to stop them. They demand your attention. The town and environs of Biggleswade are not safe. There is a murderer loose, a cruel and unusual killer. He strikes on the highway, but is no footpad, nor common robber. For the last 20 years, he has plied an evil trade in lane and highway, sometimes alone, sometimes with accomplices. I will reveal his name to John and John alone when the time is right. There will be no more spirit dealings tonight.
Then suddenly John's trance was over. His eyes snapped open. He was alert.
Well, that was a revelation,
he declared. After prayers were said, the circle was broken. Winifred was concerned to see all of the guests except a glass of brandy before leaving far earlier than they would do normally. John seemed not to notice their reticence to linger. He was full of the fire of spirit, as he liked to call it, the slightly manic mood he sometimes exhibited after a spirit circle or when completing automatic writing exercises in his study.
It's got to be the drowning at Watermill Bridge, the dreadful murder of that young girl back in 57 that the spirits were talking about. They sounded young. I told you, Winnie. I told you that it was no coincidence. These deaths happening on the roads around here. And now we hear from the spirit companions of the girl herself. Murder, they said. Murder. I told you so at the time, did I not?
Yes, you did, John, Winifred admitted. But Winifred was wary. There was something about all of this that she did not like, did not trust. It felt like Robin Ashpole was leading her brother on a merry dance. She narrowed her eyes and quietly cursed the spirit who had begun to guide John through his spiritualist adventures. Welcome. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. Today's episode is the first part in a fascinating and twisting tale of Victorian spiritualism, ghost sightings, and how that led me to discover the truth of Murder Bridge. Now, you don't have to have listened to the earlier episode from February about Murder Bridge to enjoy this one, but you might want to go back and listen to it anyway, especially as the episode has an interview with Wayne of eerie Edinburgh fame towards the end of it. The scene at the Spirit Circle I opened today's episode with is one I imagined. We don't know exactly how John Francis Hunt received his messages from beyond the grave. We know that sometimes he received messages whilst alone, but that he was also a passionate and vocal spiritualist who continued to champion the belief even when it became less fashionable towards the end of the 19th century. So it seems very likely that he held spirit circles. And we know through a letter that he wrote to Scotland Yard that he believed that the death of a girl found drowned beneath a bridge along the Potton Road was in fact murder, and not an accident, as the authorities had decided. So buckle up for the first part of a thrilling story of Victorian true crime, ghosts, spiritualism, and the law. But before we embark, just a reminder that the last Patreon episode released in August exclusively for Patreon subscribers was about sleep paralysis, relating to our last main episode with Dr. Kieran O'Keefe. And thank you to all of you who got in touch with me after that episode, sharing your own experiences of sleep paralysis. I think I will return to the subject later and definitely record some of the experiences that people have shared with me if they're willing to. The next exclusive Patreon episode, which will be released in a couple of weeks, is all about my visit to one of Scotland's most ancient and curious folk customs, the Queen's Ferry Buryman. Now, I spent a day travelling with the Buryman on his route around the Scottish town of Queensferry and was lucky enough to interview the Buryman himself and his attendants. It is some sight indeed to watch a grown man covered head to ankle in sticky burdock seed heads, drink whiskey, greet babies and dogs on a 9-hour extravaganza of community spirit. And you can hear all about it on the next Patreon episode. But don't worry, next year, in the run-up to the Buryman, so probably July time, I will release a full episode going into more depth about the Buryman and his traditions and what it all means. To hear these exclusive episodes on Patreon, though, all you have to do is sign up to Patreon for just £3.50 a month. The details are in the show description where you're listening. And if you can't sign up for a monthly subscription, and I completely understand why, then you could also support the show as and when you're able through Ko-fi.com. Again, the details are in the show description. But there are many other ways that are completely free to support Weird in the Wade. You can rate or review the show where you listen, follow the show on social media, or just tell your friends and family about the podcast. The best way to support the show, of course, is to keep listening. As always, thank you to all of you for your continued support and for listening to Weird in the Wade. Remember to keep listening until the end for shout-outs and other news, including the British Podcast Awards. Previously on Weird in the Wade. Great, I get to say it again. Previously on Weird in the Wade. So, back in February 2024, I told the story of Biggleswade's Murder Bridge. Now, it's a vague kind of tale. First of all, no one can decide which bridge on the Potton Road, just outside Biggleswade, Murder Bridge actually is. There's a bridge near the hospital on the corner of the common, but there's also Watermill Bridge, which is on a bend as you approach Sutton from Biggleswade. The bend is known locally as Murder Bend. Local children know the story of Murder Bridge, or at least they did in the 80s and 90s, and one or both of the bridges have been known as Murder Bridge since at least the 1950s. I discovered a newspaper article which referred to Murder Bridge. The generally accepted story goes that during the Second World War, a nurse had been found murdered under the bridge and now haunted that place. She would leap out, cape flying and scare away children. The bridge nearest the hospital seemed to lend itself best to this story. But I found no evidence of any murders or suspicious deaths associated with those bridges. I did find a 19th century murder on the Potton Road, but the victim was a man, and it seemed to be highway robbery, and no bridge was mentioned. In the end, I concluded that a real 1940s murder of a nurse in the nearby grounds of the Three Counties Asylum, as it was known then, could have inspired the story, and I assumed we would never know the truth. How wrong I was. One thing I've learnt since researching Weird in the Wade is that communities have longer memories than you'd realise, and most stories have a pearl of truth at their heart that, when discovered, only gleams the brighter thanks to the sands of time. Uncovering the truth. I stumbled across a breadcrumb trail to the truth, or at least some of it, completely by accident, which is often the way. I was searching for stories related to Pegnut Wood in Sutton, the tiny hamlet between Potton and Biggleswade with a beautiful 13th century packhorse bridge. This was for the Patreon episode about Pegnut Wood. The story I found was from the Biggleswade Chronicle, printed on the 6th of January 1922. At first it looked uninspiring. It was part of the minutes reported from the December Hospital Board meeting in Biggleswade. The meeting was attended by the matron of the hospital, the clerk and chairman, as well as board members. The first item seemed to be quite ordinary, about fruit and nuts being generously donated for patients over Christmas. Then came the unusual item of a ghost story on the agenda. Mr. Manson, the chair, and Mr. Chandler, the clerk, together told what was described as a frightening story. It went something like this. A ghost sighting. On a fine winter's day in December, a group of cyclists were enjoying the sunny but crisp weather, out on a ride along the lanes and tracks around Sutton, Potton and Cockayne Hatley. I don't have the names of these cyclists nor the size of their group, but let's say the lead cyclist is called Ed and his friend Tom is with him amongst a few others. They are friends who survived the First World War and who for their own well-being and health regularly cycle in the countryside as a way to stave off the vivid images and sounds that crowd their minds after the horrors of the trenches. As the sun began to sink in the afternoon sky, they decided to head back home to Biggleswade, cycling along the Potton Road. They took the bend, now known as Murder Bend, and continued towards the hospital, when suddenly, out of the hedge, on the south side of the road, by the corner of the common, something large, grey and voluminous sprang out in front of them. Ed, startled by the size and suddenness of this apparition, came tumbling off his bike to the side of the road. Tom and the others all stopped, confused and a little shaken. All had witnessed the grey, amorphous shape appear out of nowhere and then disappear just as suddenly and inexplicably. They were all baffled. Ed had a few scratches to his arm and head, and it was decided to seek help at the Checkers Inn, just on the other side of the road from them. The Checkers did well, being opposite the busy hospital, and was still open, it being just before 3 p.m, so the cyclists were gladly admitted, and Ed was given some rudimentary first aid for his scratches. Being in shock, the cyclists willingly told the landlord and staff and customers what they had witnessed. Something which they'd be more reluctant to do once the shock wore off. They described what seemed impossible. A grey, cloaked creature had leapt out from nowhere and then disappeared whilst in the middle of the road. Ed expected the crowd listening to laugh or chide him for being silly, but instead, a cold shiver ran through the group and a whisper rippled around them. A whisper that Ed did not like the sound of at all. Then the landlord spoke.
You're not the first to encounter a grey spectre at that bridge. No, we've had customers refuse to walk home alone after dark because of that grey ghost. It appears to them. Bertie Darrington's lad, Arthur, hid in the hedge next to the hospital gate in terror after encountering that grey ghost last month. He was there until the constable discovered him and took him for a vagrant. Scared half to death Arthur was by the sight of the grey ghost. He's not left his home in Potton since and is under the doctor for his sickness since his encounter.
Now, whether the majority of these sightings occurred after customers had been drinking in the Checkers rather than before, as in the case of the cyclists, I don't think we'll ever know. But this is the story that the hospital board share. It's hard to tell if it's told as a kind of Christmas ghost story or if there's genuine concern about others experiencing the phantom, especially as they do mention that a man from Potton was found in the hedge by the hospital gate in a state of fear and is still unwell after his ordeal. But the story doesn't end there. No, there is speculation from the clerk, Chandler, as to who this grey ghost is, because he remembers the late Mr. John Francis Hunt, bookseller, printer and stationer of Biggleswade, as having been entwined in the story of a young woman who was murdered and found beneath that bridge. Chandler says the murder of the young woman happened many years ago. He goes on to say that Hunt claimed to know who the murderer was. As you can imagine, reading this, my blood ran cold. It appeared that there had indeed been a murder. After all, I also had a name connected with the murder, John Francis Hunt, and a time frame. It all must have happened some years before 1920. This was brilliant information, and I began to search. 1857. Through finding more information about John Francis Hunt, the man who held the séance at the start of the episode, I was able to refine my search even further, because in an article from 1877, the murder at the bridge is referred to as having taken place during the 1850s. And it was that piece of information that took me to the centre of the puzzle, the one terribly sad death which sparked 170 years of rumour, ghost stories and fear. We'll come back to John Francis Hunt shortly, but now I want to focus on the girl at the heart of the murder bridge story, Elizabeth, or as she was known to her family and friends, Eliza Lawson. Elizabeth Lawson was born in 1840, probably in Sandy. It's difficult to be sure. There are two Elizabeth Lawsons born around the same time locally. Neither make it into adulthood, and it's difficult to know which is which. But I'm pretty certain that our Elizabeth or Eliza Lawson grew up in Sandy. As a baby, she is with her mother and father on the 1841 census. Her father is an agricultural labourer. 10 years later, she is still in Sandy, but now living with her uncle and aunt on her father's side of the family. He is a gardener, and Eliza is at school. One of her cousins is a lace maker and another a straw platter. What we do know is that the last time Eliza Lawson was seen alive was on Wednesday the 24th of June around 5 in the evening by a Samuel Jakins, or Jakes, who saw Eliza on Watermill Lane near the bridge. Jakins is described as a sawyer, and no, I didn't know what a sawyer was either, but it appears it's someone who chops and saws wood for a living. It seems he lived in Potton for a time and Gamlingay. He was 53 in 1857. He'd been born in Huntingdonshire. He was married with several children who'd all been born locally, but Samuel Jakins disappears from the records after the 1851 census, and I can't find a death record for him either. After Jakins' sighting of Eliza, she is not seen again until her body is found beneath the Watermill Bridge, the bridge on Murder Bend, not the one nearer to the hospital. The first newspaper reports declare that it is a foul murder, but by Saturday the 27th of June, the Bedfordshire Times and Independent is reporting no foul play. You may remember Coroner Eagles from the Potton Poisoner case last summer. Well, he is presiding over Elizabeth's inquest, along with Lord Burgoyne of Sutton. This happened extremely close to his land. In fact, at that point, it may even have been on his land. It is decided that although many in the area have supposed murder, that in fact there are no signs of interference with the body, no marks of violence or foul play. 17-year-old Eliza Lawson was found lying on her back with the water covering her face, and the jury at the inquest, after some investigation, give a verdict of found drowned. A verdict that was certainly controversial and disagreed with by some locally. Sadly, the newspapers I have access to do not contain any of the gossip or theories from the community, but the reports make it clear that murder is still suspected by many. And it is understandable why the community might think this. The brook is described in some newspapers as being but a ditch. And today, as then, it is not deep, and a fit and healthy 17-year-old who was conscious would be able to clamber out of that ditch with little problem. As the inquest reports do not mention any injury to Eliza's head, then it seems unlikely that she fell and hit it, becoming unconscious. Surely that would have been reported if just to quell the speculation. It is possible to drown in just a few inches of water, but it is very difficult to drown in a few inches of water if you are conscious and do not want to drown, unless someone or something is preventing you from getting out of the water. Modern medical understanding was still developing in the mid-19th century, and some health conditions that might cause a seizure or loss of consciousness might not have been picked up in an autopsy or inquest as they would today. Similarly, some signs of murder would also not have been recognised as they might today. There is no mention of toxicology reports to see if Eliza had been drinking or if she had been drugged. But if she had been drinking, then I'm sure this would have been reported. The inquests of the time are full of details of the perils of drunkenness. There was obviously no suspicion of poisoning. As we know from the Pot and Poisoner, the Victorians had tests for such things. But unlike today, in a suspicious death, they would not necessarily be routinely conducted. If they were, the papers did not report on them. I think it's fair to say we'll never know what caused Elizabeth Lawson to drown in Watermill Brook, but I am pleased that we can give her a name at last. Discovering her identity did really move me back in June. I walked up to nearby farmland, land that Eliza Lawson would have known, and I recorded some of my thoughts. It's really hard for me to put into words how I felt when I discovered the truth about Murder Bridge. It's been a joke for so long in Biggleswade. You know, I remember somebody asked about ghost stories, not me for once, on our local Facebook group, and somebody piped up straight away, "Oh, don't tell them about Murder Bridge." And there was a lot of eye rolling, and as in eye rolling emojis and people laughing, and it's kind of that story that people of a certain age know about the town. Not everybody knows the story, but a lot of people do, and it's seen as a bit of a joke. And obviously over the mists of time, things got misconstrued and forgotten and changed. And so normally when I discover the truth and I follow the clues and the breadcrumbs and you get to the end and you find out what it was really all about, there's a sense of completion and satisfaction and, you know, kind of giddy happiness. Look, I've done it. I've found out what the mystery was. But in this case, I just felt sad. I felt sad that we'll never know who Elizabeth Lawson really was. We won't know how she really died. We'll never know if Hunt was right. Was there a killer on the loose, murdering people along the Potton and Gamlingay roads? We'll never know if Hunt came up with this theory through his own observations or because he believed a spirit had told him. All these unanswered questions, and the one question that we have answered is that really sadly there was a death under that bridge. She was 17, the same age as one of my nieces is currently, and I don't even think she has a grave, or if she has, it's been long forgotten and overgrown because it's not listed on any of the databases. It is amazing how the folklore of a place can last as long as it does. And I just hope that Elizabeth Lawson is in peace. And that in her short life she experienced joy and sunshine on her face and the sound of birdsong, and had at least some happy times. John Francis Hunt. There was one person who seems to have single-handedly and possibly unintentionally made sure that the story of Eliza Lawson's death remained in the local folk memory, even if her name was forgotten. And that person was John Francis Hunt. Here's his obituary from the Biggleswade Chronicle in February 1906. The death of Mr. J. F. Hunt, It is with much regret we announce the death of Mr. J.F. Hunt, one of the best known inhabitants of Biggleswade. Notwithstanding his great age, he being in his 77th year, he was hale and active until a little while ago, and his figure was frequently to be seen in public. On Saturday, January the 20th, he had a paralytic stroke and lingered on until Wednesday last, when a comparatively young man, Mr. Hunt, came from Lincolnshire to Biggleswade. He carried on for many years the business of bookseller and newsagent, and also did some printing work. A well-read man and fond of controversy, Mr. Hunt was frequently in evidence as a newspaper correspondent, occasionally putting his contribution into rhyme. When spiritualism was more spoken about than it is these days, he was attracted by its promise, and until the end he was one of the firmest believers in it. Of late years, he wrote many letters to the press in support of his claims to be Shakespeare's secretary, being he maintained in direct spiritual communication with the poet. He published a few verses which he declared had been dictated to him, along with many others by Shakespeare, giving, however, no explanation of the poet's silence regarding points on which his biographers have long sought in vain for information. Shakespeare was not the only poet who sought to use Mr. Hunt as a medium for conveying his thoughts to the world from the abode of spirit. Homer had dictated to him a poem in English of 1,000 lines. A publisher for all these communications was not forthcoming, and they are now lost to the world. With all his eccentricities, Mr. Hunt was a public-spirited citizen, a good neighbour, a pleasant companion, and a thoroughly upright man. In politics, he ranged himself on the liberal side. His life was in the right, and he gained in large measure the respect of his fellow townsmen. I thought the obituary was a good way to start because I think it shows what high esteem he was viewed with in the town, in spite, or maybe because, of his eccentricities, some of which we are going to explore shortly. As the obituary states, John Francis Hunt moved to Biggleswade at some point in his mid to late 20s. He was born in Branston, a small village outside Lincoln. John's father Francis was a respectable man. In the 1841 census, he is recorded as being of independent means. In the 1851 census, at the age of 80, he is described as a proprietor of flowers and having some kind of farm. By now, 21-year-old John is an apprentice stationer, and by the time he is 30, he is living and working in Biggleswade as a printer, bookseller and stationer. However, I'd speculate that John must have moved to Biggleswade by 1857 because of his interest in the death of Eliza Lawson. Maybe it was one of the first shocking things he encountered on moving to Biggleswade at around the age of 27. Maybe that's why it left an impression on him. His older sister by 5 years, Winifred, who had been briefly married to a Mr. Macpherson before being widowed, moved with her brother to Biggleswade and kept house for him. Winifred never married again, and in a way she was probably better off not doing so if she wanted to have some independence. As a widow, living with her brother, keeping house for him, she would have had a level of respect and freedom, including financial freedom, most married women were not afforded in Victorian times. 1876. John Francis Hunt is first mentioned in the newspapers in the 1870s. It's likely that he has appeared in the press before this time as well, but the records of earlier newspapers are always harder to find. But this first sustained press presence is in the year of 1876, when he is tangled up with an inquest into the death of a greengrocer who was found fatally injured on the Hatley Road from Gamlingay. Now, bear with me here because I'm going to tell you about John Cole Hillsden, his tragic death, and the inquest into it. Our man, John Francis Hunt, doesn't crop up again until the inquest. And when he does, it's also a very twisty tale of an anonymous letter he's accused of writing, as well as a letter he admits to sending to Scotland Yard, criticising local police and magistrates. All of it, I promise you, is relevant because it's how his suspicions about the death of Eliza Lawson become known publicly and preserved in the memory of Mr. Chandler at that hospital board meeting some 45 years later. So sit back as I tell you the tale, the death of John Cole Hilsden. On October the 19th, 1876, Mr. John Cole Hilsden was by all accounts having an ordinary and pleasant day. He was a greengrocer who lived in Potton on Post Office Street and was generally known as Mr. Cole, Cole's being the name of his business. So I'll call him John Cole as well. He was around 54 and seems to have entered a kind of semi-retirement in moving to Potton after running a much larger greengrocer's business in Hitchin. On the afternoon of the 19th, he caught a train from Potton to Gamlingay at around 2:30. I do wish we still had those local train lines. Once in Gamlingay, he met with one of his suppliers, a farmer named Mr. Roxburgh. He paid a bill to Roxburgh for produce and took tea in the farmhouse. Cole left at around 6:30 to catch the 7:20 train home. The next person to see John Cole alive was a farmer named William Gifford. I'm guessing his interaction with Cole haunted him for the rest of his life. Gifford was riding his horse along the Hatley Road when he saw what he thought was a drunk lying under a hedge. So he, and I quote, touched the drunk with a whip and demanded he get up. It wasn't a drunk. It was John Cole. He did not move. He only groaned. And Gifford did not get down from his horse. Instead, he rode to the Sultan Inn and informed the landlord that one of his customers was drunk in a hedge. The landlord, saying none of his customers had left his establishment worse for wear that night, immediately went out with a search party. But it being dark, they could not locate anyone. At around 8 p.m, a gamekeeper named Mr. Joy discovered a body lying in a ditch. He struck a match and in the flaring light recognised the body as that of the Potton greengrocer. Help was sent for, and Cole, alive but insensible, was loaded onto a cart and sent to a doctor's in Gamlingay. And then he was sent back home to Potton, where a surgeon saw him and announced that it was a hopeless case. Lloyd Burgoyne was sent for, so that if John Cole regained consciousness, he could take a deposition from him, but Cole died of his injuries at 11:30 that night. The police later discovered a pool of blood where John Cole had been found, and about a quarter of a mile away, by a spinney, they discovered his walking stick and a smashed bottle of cream, which Farmer Roxburgh had given him. There was blood pooled at this place also. Initially, it was reported in the press that Cole had died of a fractured skull caused by a strangely shaped implement which had been driven into his head. However, the doctor who conducted a post-mortem said that Cole had received a blow to the front of his head and then received a blow to the back. Granite was found in the wound at the back of his head, matching the stone where he was assumed to have fallen. The doctor could not say whether the blow to the front caused Cole to fall straight away and hit the back of his head, or whether there was some time between the two injuries. As was the practice back then, an inquest was quickly convened, but more unusually, was adjourned twice. On the third iteration of the inquest, John Francis Hunt appeared and a very peculiar story unfolded. The inquest. The third and final stage of the inquest took place almost a month after Cole's death, and it is reported on at length on the 18th of November in the Bedfordshire Mercury, as well as in other local newspapers. The first two witnesses called are two young lads. They give evidence about their whereabouts on October the 19th. They were on their way to evening classes at school. They tell of seeing two bricklayers walking home from work. The bricklayers were named Croot and Arnold. The boys note that the brickies were walking really fast, but they say that working men often do when on their way home for tea or to the pub after a long day of work. Next, the lads say that they saw Farmer Gifford go past on his horse. Arnold and Croot, the bricklayers, don't deny being on the road at the same time as John Cole. They tell a tale of seeing two strange men on the road that night also, but no other witnesses see these two strange men, and Arnold and Croot's description of them differs significantly from each other of where or how these men were walking. They both agree that they encountered Cole though, and that he was somewhat staggering, but not looking ill or hurt. One other piece of evidence is that a butcher's boy from Potton hired a horse in Gamlingay just before 7. Some witnesses claim he rode away at a frightful pace, one speculating he had placed a bet that he could be in Potton within 15 minutes. On hearing of the death of Cole the next day, however, the young butcher boy claimed that the horse had run away from him that night, yet he had not reported this at the time. It's established then that within about 15 minutes before Farmer Gifford mistakes Cole for a drunk, the bricklayers definitely encountered Cole, and the runaway horse, if indeed it had run away, may well have done also. However, the brickies did not see the runaway horse and claim that they left Cole unhurt, just passing by him on the road. Next, John Francis Hunt is called to the stand, and the case takes a sudden turn. A letter sent to Scotland Yard and an anonymous note become the subject of scrutiny. And here is what the newspapers reported as being said at the inquest. And don't worry, you do get to hear the content of these mysterious letters eventually. John Francis Hunt, printer and bookseller, was next examined on being sworn in. He was interrogated as follows by the deputy coroner.
Is the letter headed murder, which I now produce in your handwriting? Did you send this letter? Yes, sir, I did. To whom did you send it? To the best of my recollection, I sent it to the Superintendent of Police at Scotland Yard. I don't know his name. I must ask you to look carefully at the other letter, headed Hatley. Is that also written by you? No, sir. Is that envelope addressed to Sir John Burgoyne written by you? No, sir. I wrote to you, I think. You swear that you didn't write this letter? Yes, sir. Will you look again at your own letter? And that headed Hatley, look at the capital B in both. They are something alike. There is a little similarity. Is there not a great similarity? I do not see a great similarity, but there is some similarity.
The coroner then handed the letters to the jury to compare the writing, but requested them not to read either yet. Do you swear that you know nothing whatsoever about this case?
I do not, save beyond that I have stated to you in my letter.
Do you know anything about Croot?
No, sir.
Nor about Arnold?
No, sir. I did not know there were such men beyond what I saw in the paper.
You never saw either Croot or Arnold or heard of them till this occurred?
No.
And you swear you never sent an anonymous letter to Sir John Burgoyne?
I do, sir.
The coroner and the jury now compared the watermarks of the two papers. And you say you never saw Croot and Arnold nor heard of them till this occurred?
Never, sir. I did not know there were such people until I saw the statement in the newspapers, and I have never seen, to my knowledge, the person who was supposed to have been murdered.
What made you send the letter to the Superintendent of Scotland Yard?
When I first heard of this death, and I heard of it before it appeared in the papers, I remembered an instance of what was supposed to be a murder on the Sutton Road some 15 years ago.
The coroner now read to the jury the witness's letter to Scotland Yard, which had been sent by Colonel Henderson of Scotland Yard to the Chief Constable of Bedfordshire, Major Warner. The letter was as follows.
Murder. Dear Sir, last night, Thursday, between the hours of 6 and 7, a man named John Cole, a grocer, residing at Potton Beds, was returning home along the highway between Hatley St George and Gamlingay railway station when he was attacked by some one or more parties unknown. He was found dreadfully injured and insensible. He was conveyed to Potton, where he died at 11 last night. 15 years ago, a murder was committed at Potton, and the perpetrators escaped detection. A few months ago, a gentleman named Wright of Gertford was robbed on the highway, the highwayman escaping. I mention these matters for your consideration. I doubt the ability of our local police constabulary to conduct such a case properly. The whole district will be in great alarm if the murderer or murderers are not detected. I think a London detective ought to act on the matter. The local magistrates are A. Peel Esquire, Sandy, Sir J. M. Burgoyne, Sutton Park, Potton, J. Foster Esquire, Sandy, and Colonel Linsell, Fairfield, Biggleswade. I presume the Dr. Walker of Brookhouse, Potton, will be the medical authority called in. I merely forward this information that you may be made cognizant of the fact of murder. I remain so yours faithfully, John Francis Hunt.
The coroner resumes his interrogation.
You sent this letter with what object? With the object expressed in the letter, of course. If you allow me to make a statement... I don't want a statement. We want you to give evidence.
Turning to the jury, the coroner continues.
Gentlemen, I shall now read the anonymous letter, which I have put in evidence by calling this witness who denies having written it. I must tell you that you must not be influenced at the least bit by the contents of this letter.
The foreman of the jury interjects. I wish to make a remark, sir, that in the letter which Mr. Hunt admits having sent to Scotland Yard, there is one sentence which is most unwarrantable.
That is nothing to do with us. We only want evidence.
The anonymous letter to Sir John Burgoyne was read out as follows.
Hatley, Bedfordshire. Sir, I can furnish you with a clue by which you can unravel the whole mystery of the alleged murder. In the first place, it was not a premeditated murder, but a violent assault originated in a quarrel, with which unwittingly terminated fatally. Some time ago, Hilsdon and Croot and Arnold had a disagreement about some matter, which was not amicably settled. On the evening of the 19th of October, Croot and Arnold had been drinking, but were not drunk. As they went along the road, they overtook Hilsdon. The old grievance came up again. During the quarrel, Arnold and Croot struck Hilsdon with a cudgel he had, not with the intention of killing him, but still harder than he would have done had he not been in a passion and had he not have been in drink. Hilsdon fell backwards, hitting his head on a stone, which caused the fatal injury. The men thought that Hilsdon was only stunned and temporarily insensible, so they picked him up and carried him along the road, hoping he would recover, but finding that he did not recover and believing that he was dying, if not already dead, and hearing some horsemen approaching, they laid him down and decamped. The statements they have made about two other men are altogether false and told for the purpose of throwing off suspicion from themselves. Quickly make an inquiry as to what this course of the disagreement was between Hilsdon, Arnold and Croot, and you will soon ascertain that it was so. Most likely, Hilsdon's widow or family can furnish you with the facts. Persuade the government or yourself to offer a large reward, and you will find, if pardon is offered to Arnold and Croot, that they will confess the whole affair. I have left home for a while in order to be out of the way, as I do not want to be called upon, nor interrogated, nor in any way mixed up in this unfortunate affair. Don't make this information public, but use it for your own guidance. Act quickly and cautiously, and avoid exciting suspicion as far as possible. Nevertheless, watch, or cause to be watchful, the doings and proceedings of the two men.
The coroner resumes his questioning. See, that is the letter, and the writing in it bears similarity to your letter. Therefore, I have called upon you to give evidence if you sent it. You have taken a good deal of interest in this matter, Mr. Hunt. Have you written any other letters in connection with it?
No, sir. Nothing in any of the public press? No, sir. Well, I think I wrote a paragraph. To what paper? The Bedford Express. What week does it appear in? It does not appear at all. How did you send it? By post, I presume. You know whether you sent it by post or not? Oh, yes, I did. Do you know if you signed your name to it? I don't suppose I did. It was an anonymous communication. I am agent for the newspaper and supply news. Would they be likely to insert news from you unless authenticated by your name? Yes, I'm in the habit of sending it to them.
At this point, it seems that Hunt is dismissed. Sir Burgoyne is recalled and asked to speak on why he shared the anonymous letter. Upon receipt of the anonymous letter, which had just been read to the jury, I confirmed with the police They went also to the house of the widow and deceased, and I found from them that, to the best of their belief, her husband had never had a difference of opinion with the men mentioned in the letter, nor did she know that they had ever dealt at her husband's shop. I will only add to the jury that I thought it was my duty to make the letter public. The anonymous letter clearly had stirred things up, though, because the whereabouts of Croot and Arnold was examined closely, particularly the fact that Croot had not turned up for work the next day. When asked about missing work, he told a vague tale of selling carrots that day, but then he won't say who bought the carrots from him. He changes his story and admits that he couldn't find a buyer for the carrots, and instead says he just talked about selling carrots with his father. Witnesses also say that Croot and Arnold have been drinking at the Sultan before the murder happened. At the end of the inquest, the coroner puts forward several suggestions for the jury to consider. Did Croot and Arnold get into an altercation with Cole? They could have met him on the road at the right time. The police had measured the distance, walked the route, and determined that Croot and Arnold had time to commit the crime, but it was a tight time frame. They might have had tools with them that could be used as a weapon. They seem to be the only ones who saw two mystery men, and their accounts don't match. Was this a way to throw the scent off them? But what was their motive? Cole was not robbed. If it was an accident, that might be why Cole was moved a quarter of a mile from the scene of his injury. It was suggested that Croot and Arnold had walked with him to get help, as was set out in the anonymous letter. But Dr. Walker doesn't think the initial injury to Hunt's head is what killed him. He's not even sure if he was struck by a weapon. Next is the theory that the butcher's boy's horse struck Cole either whilst the boy was riding him, far too fast and dangerously, or after it ran away. But that has issues too. Why was Cole's body found a quarter of a mile away from the site of his initial injury? The doctor is certain that Cole couldn't have walked a quarter of a mile unaided once injured. But it is suspicious that the boy didn't report the runaway horse sooner. Did Cole fall and hit his head? This would make sense if it hadn't been for the fact that he was struck at the front of his head first. The doctor's description reads almost as if Cole fell forward first, hit his head, and then sometime later fell backwards, causing the fatal injury. Blood is only found in two spots, a quarter of a mile apart, though how good the police were at finding evidence along the road between these points is unclear. The jury deliberate and come to a verdict of unexplained death, what would be called open verdict nowadays. For what it's worth, I wonder if something like this happened. The runaway horse knocks down Cole, maybe with the butcher boy still riding it. It's enough for him to lose the bottle of cream and his walking stick, but he's only hit the front of his head. Arnold and Croot come across Cole staggering about and decide to help, but their help leads to him falling and hitting his head a quarter of a mile away down the road. They realise that he's now gravely injured and panic. They run and make up a story about two suspicious men on the road to cover their tracks. In that scenario, no one murdered John Cole. It was a series of tragic events involving individuals too afraid to tell the truth, and an open verdict is probably the best that could be achieved. It must have been incredibly difficult for Cole's family to be left not knowing what really happened to their husband and father. But it's also not the end of the affair for John Francis Hunt, and all because of the anonymous letter. Now, did Hunt write that letter? I don't think we'll ever really know, but there's a couple of indications that might mean that he did, which we'll come to later. Libel. The following June, John Francis Hunt finds himself in court again. Croot and Arnold, the bricklayers, have taken a libel case against him, instructing solicitors Mitchell and Webb. Yeah, I can't imagine this court case now without it turning into a comedy. If you're not from the UK, do look up Mitchell and Webb. You won't regret it. The case is brought with the understanding that Hunt did, in fact, write the anonymous letter, naming Arnold and Croot as unwitting murderers, which was read out at the inquest. As a consequence, their reputations have been tarnished, they say, though they do admit in court that they had not lost any work over it, and mostly they have just been ribbed and teased. Mitchell and Webb solicitors write to John Hunt, advising him of their client's claims and recommending he seek legal advice on settling the matter with them quickly. But he writes back, refusing to. He says,
"I scarcely need to remind you that it is an easy thing and one of common occurrence to firmly hold a conviction and yet be entirely mistaken. Unless the writer of the anonymous letter had some personal evidence which he would not or dare not divulge, I cannot see that he committed any moral or legal misdemeanour beyond the impropriety of expressing an unsupported opinion, which was of course as likely to be as wrong as right."
Hunt seems to have had a lot of sympathy for the anonymous letter writer and says that his evidence has not changed since the inquest. Namely, he did not write the anonymous letter. Mitchell and Webb write more letters, threatening John Hunt with a writ for libel. He ignored these letters. They write again. Eventually, Hunt sends them a very different reply indeed.
"Gentlemen, for you and your respectable clients, I feel the utmost contempt. Your previous letters I put in their proper place, namely the fire. Although I pity the poor devils who are in your hands, yet birds of a feather, etc. Yours, J.F. Hunt."
So a court case is set, and John Francis Hunt is an hour and 20 minutes late to the proceedings, which start without him. When he arrives, Lord Burgoyne is giving evidence. Hunt chooses not to interrogate any of his witnesses. The undersheriff instead asks questions. He's clearly a man with a keen sense of legal propriety. Hunt is questioned by the jury and the undersheriff, and in an excited manner, it is described, he denies totally that he wrote the letter. The jury disagree, and they convict Hunt of libel, and he is bid to pay £10 in damages to the victims. It appears that he does pay that sum. Now, did Hunt write the anonymous letter? Well, he wrote many letters, and he wrote many anonymous letters, as he admits. But that's not evidence that he wrote this letter of accusation. In a moment, I'll look at maybe one of the motives for why he might have done it, but I think there's another clue. Whoever wrote this letter did not know John Cole, because he refers to him throughout as Hilsdon, a name which he generally was not known by. Many of the witnesses who had known him through his greengrocer's business at the inquest are surprised to discover that his full name was John Cole Hilsdon. So whoever wrote the anonymous letter did not know him and is probably only acting on information that they have read in the newspapers. I think that puts a tick against it likely being not necessarily John Hunt, but someone like John Hunt. It's somebody who did not know Cole in real life. Hunt's behaviour, though, throughout all of this is quite odd. He pivots from a concerned, helpful and polite citizen to an angry and uncooperative defendant. His responses to the coroner at the inquest are also quite feisty. He shows sympathy for the letter writer, but again he denies that he wrote the letter. But as I said, I think I know, or at least I have a theory about what actually happened here or what could have happened. And the ghost story told at the hospital board meeting holds a clue. The Biggleswade Chronicle article from 1922 explains that Chandler had said, "The late Mr. Hunt, who kept the bookshop opposite the town hall, was a spiritualist who wrote a letter to the paper that a man who murdered this woman, the ghost of Murder Bridge, was a man from Gamlingay. They brought an action against Hunt. He took no notice of it until it was brought to the sheriff to assess damages. At this point, Hunt sought legal advice from Chandler's late business partner. The result was that Hunt had to pay £400 in damages." Now, Chandler is sharing this story 16 years after Hunt's death and 45 years after the libel case involving Hunt, Arnold and Crute. So it can be forgiven that some of the details are slightly off. The libel case was not about the death of Eliza Lawson. But so much of the rest of the account is right. The man from Gamlingay, well, it's two men from Gamlingay. the accusation of murder, the ignoring of the libel accusations. And I'm also wondering if by 1922 the £400 would be loosely equivalent to 1877's £10 fine when considering inflation. Although the anonymous letter did not accuse Arnold and Crute of murdering Elizabeth Lawson, the letter to Scotland Yard seems to imply that there was an unsolved murder along the Potton Road that matches hers. And Hunt also mentions this murder at the inquest. But Chandler gives us another clue, that John Francis Hunt was a spiritualist, and this was linked to his knowledge of who the murderer was. John Hunt's belief in the spirit world was so unshakable that if he received a message from spirit, he would believe it and indeed act upon it. In the next episode, I'll share stories with you that prove this, but thankfully aren't about murder. And when I say receive messages from the spirit world, I do not know whether the spirits can communicate with us and communicate with John Francis Hunt, but he certainly thought they could. Hunt also practiced automatic writing whilst in a trance, which he believed brought him into contact with the spirit world. This is where John would write whatever came into his head in a stream of consciousness, claiming the spirits guided his hand. And I wonder that if he wrote a letter accusing two men of being involved in a murder whilst performing automatic writing, would he fully believe that he had not written that letter himself? I wonder if he would, in good conscience, stand up in court twice and deny being the author of that letter because he believed that it was a spirit that had written it through him, he being more akin to a pen that the spirit worked. Now, I have no proof that this is what he believed in relation to this anonymous letter or that he wrote it, but in the next episode we'll learn of how he certainly did believe this of his other automatic writings. We'll never know what was in John Hunt's prepared statement that he wanted to read at the inquest, but maybe he wanted to tell the court in his own words about the messages he'd received by spirit. I'm pretty sure that when he seeks assistance from Chandler's business partner about the libel, the legal advice would be, do not mention the spirits in any circumstances and just pay the fine. The British legal system was not prepared to hear about John's spiritualist beliefs, and he should keep quiet. However, John Francis Hunt could not keep quiet about the other dealings he had with the spirit world, as we will see in the next episode. Conclusions and next time. It seems quite miraculous that I was able to solve the mystery of how Murder Bridge got its name by way of a hospital board meeting and a 19th century spiritualist. I don't know if Hunt wrote the anonymous letter, but he certainly wrote thousands of letters, both signed and anonymous, through his life. He was a prolific contributor to the newspapers, and some may have characterised him as a meddler in things that did not concern him. If he was alive today, I imagine he'd be an habitual, if erudite, social media user and sometime keyboard warrior. I believe that if he thought he had a message from the spirit world on a subject as important as murder, he would try to get that message out in any way he could. But he also wasn't stupid. He knew that if he went out there and said, "The spirits told me this," he would be dismissed, ignored. He clearly felt that Elizabeth Lawson's death and that of the man robbed on the highway and the death of Cole were suspicious, in the very least. But whether the police and the magistrates he named were corrupt or incompetent, I can't say. But he lived in a world where crime was often unsolved or unsatisfactorily investigated. He put his faith in the modern methods of detection being practiced by the inspectors of Scotland Yard. Sadly, it came to naught. But thanks to his attempts, whether he wrote the anonymous letter or not, he certainly wrote the letter to Scotland Yard, and by doing so was sucked into the legal proceedings around Cole's death, meaning that 167 years after her death, Elizabeth Lawson can be remembered as the unfortunate 17-year-old who met her death beneath the bridge over Watermill Brook. Eliza was a daughter, sister, and no doubt friend, missed dearly by those who knew her. A young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and who would never have guessed that over a century and a half, stories of a ghost haunting of a bridge where she died would grow and shift, but eventually they would be traced back to her, Elizabeth, or Eliza Lawson of Sandy. In the next episode, we'll learn about John Francis Hunt's spirit writings, his contact with the ghosts of Shakespeare and other literary greats. We'll also learn about yet another brush he has with the law when he embarks on an ill-advised treasure hunt using information he's gleaned from beyond the grave. In the late 19th century, John Francis Hunt put Biggleswade on the map for the most peculiar of reasons. We'll explore Victorian spiritualism as well as those who attempted to debunk the practice and the tensions that this caused within society and amongst friends. Thank you for listening to this episode of Weird in the Wade. Before we get to the trailer for the Rue Papers, which I mentioned right at the start of the show, I have a few shout outs and a reminder about the British Podcast Awards. Firstly, I'd like to say a huge thank you to my new Patreon supporters: Embroidered Yeti, Rosie Nix, Melanie Arnold, Donna Owen, and Helen Elmer. Welcome to Team Weird, and I hope you enjoy the bonus content over on Patreon. Also, thank you to Manda and Vegetable Warmth for buying the podcast a coffee over on Ko-fi. Thank you. I really appreciate your support. The Listener's Choice Award at the British Podcast Awards is almost over, but if you're listening to this before August the 30th, 2024, you can still vote for Weird in the Wade in the link that I've shared in the show description. By the time the next episode comes out, I should have attended the British Podcast Awards night, and I promise to give you an update on how it all went. Also, keep a lookout in social media for other updates about the Podcast Awards. If you remember, Weird in the Wade has been nominated in the Best History Podcast category, and that category is judged by a panel of judges. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Theme music is by M Savigear, additional ghost voices by M Savigear, all other additional music and sound effects from Epidemic Sound. And now, let me introduce you to the Rue Papers. You can find the first couple of episodes on Apple, Spotify and Podbean apps. But here's the trailer.
My name is Beatrice. I'm a librarian. Just an ordinary librarian. My job is... Well, at the moment, my job is to sit in a basement and read these papers. They're the papers of an old paranormal research society. The Rue Society. They're ghost stories. They're just stories. They don't mean anything, really. The thing about stories, you see, is they're real. They can do things to you. When you read a story out loud, when you put those words into the world, it makes things happen. It opens doorways.
There's a crack.
It shows you the path. You have to be very careful with stories. I haven't done anything wrong. They're just stories. All I had to do was read them. I didn't mean for the rest to happen. I didn't do anything wrong. I just did as I was supposed to. I just did what I was told. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. I should never have read the stories. But then, there was no one to tell me not to. So here I am, telling you, don't read the Rue Papers. You've no idea what will happen if you do.
Set us free.
I wish I had known.
Bring us home.
It's too late to stop it now.
Open the door. Open the gate.
The Rue Papers. A new horror podcast coming 10th of August.